He stood at the podium wiping away a tear he did not shed and told 150 people that our mother died waiting for a daughter who never came. He pointed at me in the crowd, calling me a ghost. He did not know a private nurse had kept a black leather journal. He did not know his own name was missing from every single page. And he certainly did not know that by trying to bury my reputation in front of Seattle elite, he was handing me the exact weapon I needed to tear his startup down to the studs. The October wind whipped off Puget Sound, biting through the wool of my trench coat as I stood 3 steps away from my mother's open grave. The cemetery was packed. 150 people gathered on the manicured grass. Venture capitalists, angel investors, and tech executives stood shoulder to shoulder with our relatives. They were not here to mourn. They were here to be seen by my older brother. Julian stood at the mahogany podium near the casket. At 35, he was the polished CEO of a Seattle tech startup. He wore a charcoal suit that fit with surgical precision. He gripped the edges of the podium, lowering his head to let the microphone catch his ragged exhale. Mom fought Alzheimer's in profound isolation, Julian said, his voice cracking with rehearsed grief. She spent her final 3 years staring at the door, praying her favorite daughter would walk through it. But Naomi could not be bothered to visit her own mother a single time. The silence that followed was suffocating. 150 pairs of eyes shifted from the podium directly to me. I could hear the rustle of expensive coats as people turned. The judgment in their stares felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Whispers rippled through the crowd. I kept my hands buried deep in my pockets. I did not lower my gaze. I did not offer them the tears they expected. Naya, his 33-year-old African-American wife, stood beside the podium. She operates as a high-level public relations director, armed with a razor-sharp intellect and a penchant for theatrical cruelty. She wore a tailored black sheath dress, her posture rigid and triumphant. Nia raised her smartphone, holding it steady to record my public humiliation. A cold, satisfied smirk played on her lips. She was gathering content to spin the narrative, ensuring the entire social circle knew I was the villain. Julian stepped down from the podium and walked to the edge of the grave. He picked up a handful of dirt. Before he dropped it onto the casket, he turned to the 2 private security guards flanking the burial site. "Do not let her near the grave," Julian instructed, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "She forfeited the right to say goodbye when she abandoned this family." The guards stepped forward, crossing their arms to form a human barricade between me and the casket. The guests watched, their expressions hardening with disgust directed at me. Nia walked over the heels of her boots, sinking slightly into the damp earth. She stopped inches from my face. "You are a parasite, Naomi," Nia whispered, keeping her tone low enough that only I could hear. "Go back to your spreadsheets. You do not exist here anymore." My jaw tightened. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The urge to scream the truth, to tear the phone from her manicured hand, burned in my throat. But data analysts do not react to noise. We react to patterns. Julian and Nia were putting on a show, establishing a hostile defense before anyone even asked a question. They were overcompensating. I turned my back on the casket, on the judgmental stares, and on the brother who had just delivered my social execution. I walked across the wet grass toward my car. Julian thought his eulogy was the final word. He thought he had successfully erased me. He had no idea his performance had just triggered a chain reaction that would leave him with nothing. My name is Naomi. I am 31 years old and I work as a senior data analyst. I track anomalies for a living. Before I tell you how I dismantled my brother's life using nothing but a calendar and a revoked license, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe liars always leave a paper trail. I did not drive to my apartment after the burial. I steered my car toward the affluent Mercer Island neighborhood where my childhood home sat, overlooking the gray waters of Lake Washington. The memorial reception was a long-standing tradition in our social circle. I knew the caterers had been booked for weeks. I knew the floral arrangements were already set on the dining tables, and the expensive wine was breathing in crystal decanters. I pulled up to the towering wrought iron security gates, expecting them to be open for the arriving guests. They were shut tight. 2 men in dark suits stood on the wet asphalt, blocking the entrance. The wind carried the biting scent of rain and cold earth. I rolled down my window. The taller guard stepped forward, holding a thick clipboard. He asked for my name, holding his posture rigid. I told him. He ran a thick finger down the printed guest list attached to his clipboard. I could see the paper from where I sat in the driver's seat. My name was printed near the top. A thick red line was drawn straight through it, cutting across the black ink with deliberate surgical precision. "You are not on the approved registry, ma'am," the guard stated. He shifted his weight, effectively blocking my line of sight up the driveway. "You need to turn your vehicle around and clear the entrance." I turned the engine off. I stepped out of the car, leaving the door open to the elements. The rain began to fall in a steady, freezing drizzle. I walked up to the iron bars, gripping the cold metal with bare hands. "I am family," I said, keeping my voice level and stripped of any tremor. "This is my mother's house." "Not anymore," a voice called out from the distance. I looked up the long paved driveway. The grand oak front doors of the estate swung open. Julian and Nia stepped out onto the wide, covered porch. They looked like a couple posing for a luxury lifestyle magazine. Julian held a crystal glass of dark red wine. Nia held a flute of champagne. My eyes locked instantly onto Nia's neck. Resting against her collarbone was a vintage double-strand pearl necklace. The pearls glowed softly in the overcast light. My chest tightened until breathing became difficult. Those pearls belonged to my mother. She had promised them to me on my 16th birthday, swearing I would wear them when I walked down the aisle. Now they draped over the neck of the woman who had just recorded my public degradation at a cemetery. Nia took a slow sip of her champagne. She leaned against one of the stone pillars, smiling down at me from her elevated position. She snapped her fingers, creating a sharp, echoing sound. She reached into her designer handbag and produced a thick manila envelope. She tossed it to a third security guard standing near the porch steps. "Give that to the unauthorized guest outside." Nia ordered, her tone dripping with unearned authority. The guard jogged down the wet driveway. He slid the envelope through the narrow gap in the iron bars. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it fall to the wet asphalt. The rain began to warp the heavy paper. I bent down and picked it up. I tore the seal. The first document was a formal cease and desist order drafted by a prominent Seattle law firm. It forbade me from setting foot on the property, entering the premises, or attempting to contact Julian regarding the estate. The second document was a printed invoice. The header read, "Memorial and Burial Services." The itemized list detailed the mahogany casket, the imported floral arrangements, the premium catering, and the private security detail. The total at the bottom was $50,000. Attached to the invoice was a yellow sticky note. The handwriting belonged to Julian. "Pay your half-parasite. $25,000 due in 30 days. I stared at the numbers printed on the page. The sheer audacity of the demand settled over me. They were drinking my mother's vintage wine. They were wearing my mother's heirloom jewelry. They had barred me from paying my final respects at the reception. And they were billing me $25,000 for a funeral where they had orchestrated my social execution. "You can mail the check to my office," Julian called out from the porch, his voice carrying a smug finality. "Do not bother showing up here again, Naomi. We are done with you." They turned around and walked back into the warmth of the house. The heavy oak doors swung shut. The metallic click of the deadbolt echoed through the rain. I stood alone on the other side of the iron gate. The freezing drizzle soaked through my wool coat, chilling my skin. A sharp wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, twisting my insides. I gripped the wet invoice. The rejection stung, but it did not shock me. This was not the first time that oak door had closed in my face. The exile had begun exactly 7 years ago. I was 24 years old. I worked 60 hours a week as a junior data analyst running complex predictive models until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I ate generic ramen and lived in a cramped studio apartment, trying to dent a mountain of high-interest student loans. I never asked my mother for a single dime. Julian, meanwhile, lived in a luxury downtown loft. He was launching his first tech startup, an application that promised to revolutionize local delivery services. My mother funded his seed round, cashing out portions of her secure investments to keep his fragile company afloat. I visited her house one Sunday afternoon to help set up a new desktop computer. She asked me to transfer her financial files from the old hard drive. I opened the accounting software to verify the data migration. My training kicked in automatically. I noticed a glaring discrepancy in her retirement portfolio. The balance was off by a significant margin. I traced the withdrawal history. Over the course of 3 months, $40,000 had been siphoned out in uncoordinated, uneven transfers. The money did not go to Julian's startup corporate account. I tracked the routing numbers using basic audit techniques. The funds were diverted to an offshore online gambling syndicate and a high-end sports car leasing agency. Julian was not building a tech company. He was bleeding her dry to fund his reckless lifestyle. I printed the transaction logs. I highlighted the routing pathways in bright yellow ink. I presented the raw data to my mother sitting at her kitchen table. I expected her to be horrified. I expected her to call the bank and freeze the accounts. I did not account for Nia. Julian and Nia arrived at the house 10 minutes later for a planned dinner. Nia took one look at the spreadsheet spread across the table and launched a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She did not argue the math. She attacked the source. "Naomi is fabricating this," Nia told my mother, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "She knows how to manipulate numbers. She does it for a living. She is just jealous that Julian is building a real company while she punches a clock in a dreary cubicle. She wants to cut off his funding so he fails. She wants you to hate him." Julian played the wounded son perfectly. He looked at the floor, shaking his head, muttering about how much it hurt to see his own sister try to frame him for theft. He squeezed his eyes shut, acting as though the betrayal was too much to bear. I stood there, pointing at the bank statements. The routing numbers matched his personal accounts. The data was undeniable. But my mother did not look at the papers. She looked at me. Her face contorted with a profound, bitter disappointment. "You would go this far to ruin your brother?" she asked, her voice shaking with rage. "You would forge bank records because you cannot stand to see him succeed." "Mom, look at the account numbers," I pleaded, pushing the papers closer to her. "It is right there in black and white." She stood up from the table. Her hand moved faster than I could track. The slap cracked against my cheek, stinging and sharp. The force of it knocked me back a step. My ear rang with a high-pitched whine. I tasted copper in the back of my throat. "Get out," my mother said, pointing a rigid finger toward the hallway. "Get out of my house." Nia walked into the guest room where I had left my overnight bag. She carried my small suitcase to the front door and tossed it onto the porch. It tumbled down the stairs, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. I looked at my mother one last time. Her eyes held no warmth, no hesitation. She looked at me like I was a stranger caught stealing silver from her dining room. "You are a liar," she said. That was the last time I saw her with a clear mind. The Alzheimer's took hold a few years later, eroding her memory until she forgot my name entirely. But I never forgot that day. I never forgot the sting of her hand or the quiet triumph shining in Nia's eyes. I stood outside the iron gates in the present, letting the cold rain wash over me. The memory faded, leaving only the sharp reality of the wet invoice in my hand. They thought the past would dictate the future. They thought I would retreat to my apartment and cry over the $25,000 bill. They thought data could be swept under the rug twice. I folded the invoice and the cease and desist order. I walked back to my car and slid into the driver's seat. My mother was gone, but the numbers remained. And numbers, unlike people, do not forget. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine idling, the heater fighting against the chill of my soaked wool coat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight the knuckles strained against the skin. The physical cold was nothing compared to the icy realization settling in my chest. They had locked me out, handed me a bill for a funeral I was barred from attending, and expected me to retreat into the shadows. I needed to stabilize my breathing. I put the car in gear and drove away from the Mercer Island estate, navigating the slick roads toward a quiet coffee shop in downtown Seattle. I needed caffeine and a neutral environment to process the tactical strike my brother had just executed. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and damp raincoats. I stood at the counter and ordered a simple black Americano. I pulled my primary credit card from my wallet and inserted the chip into the point-of-sale terminal. The machine processed for 3 seconds before emitting a sharp negative beep. Declined. I frowned. I handed the barista my secondary card, a debit linked to my main checking account. Another insertion. Another pause. Another rejection. The young barista offered a tight, sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for people whose lives are visibly falling apart at the register. I handed him a crumbled $10 bill from my pocket, took my paper cup, and walked to a secluded table in the back corner. A data analyst does not panic over a declined transaction. A data analyst checks the source code. I unlocked my smartphone and opened my primary banking application. My checking account balance was intact. The funds were there. But a red banner flashed across the top of the screen, an alert from the Integrated Credit Monitoring Service. My credit score, a number I had meticulously cultivated to a flawless 800 over the past decade, had plummeted into the high 500s. It was marked in a severe cautionary red. I clicked on the detailed credit report. The screen loaded, revealing a financial crime scene that made the air trap in my lungs. 6 months ago, a series of hard inquiries had been initiated using my Social Security number. Following those inquiries, 4 premium credit cards were opened under my name. The credit limits were aggressive, ranging from $15,000 to $20,000 each. Every single one of those cards was currently maxed out, accumulating predatory interest rates and late fees. But the credit cards were just the surface-level damage. I scrolled down to the commercial liabilities section. A commercial business loan had been originated 5 months prior. The principal amount was $85,000. The loan was unsecured approved based on my previously immaculate credit history and my steady income as a data analyst. The first payment had been missed 30 days ago. The account was in pre-default status. I tapped the details of the commercial loan, looking for the origination data. The mailing address listed for all the statements, notices, and billing cycles was not my Seattle apartment. The address was the Mercer Island estate, the very house Julian had just banned me from entering. The architecture of Julian's scheme crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. Julian was not just a greedy brother trying to secure a larger slice of our mother's estate. He was a drowning man grasping at illegal lifelines. His tech startup, the company my mother had funded at the expense of my college education, was failing. Venture capital firms do not inject cash into sinking ships. Traditional banks do not lend to founders with leveraged assets and bleeding balance sheets. Julian had run out of legitimate funding, so he created a ghost. He used my identity. When my mother exiled me 7 years ago, I left behind boxes of old mail tax documents and childhood records in the attic. Julian had unrestricted access to my sensitive data. He used my pristine financial standing to fabricate a synthetic profile, funneling over $150,000 in illicit credit and business loans to keep his dying company afloat. He routed all the physical mail to the estate. Knowing my mother's Alzheimer's prevented her from noticing, and knowing I was not allowed near the mailbox. He had drained the funds, missed the payments, and positioned me to take the devastating fall. When the creditors inevitably handed the accounts to collection agencies, they would hunt me down. If the commercial lender suspected fraud, they would file a report with the authorities. I would be forced to navigate a labyrinth of legal defenses, trying to prove identity theft against a brother who had carefully hidden his digital tracks. Julian was banking on my silence. He calculated that the discarded, estranged daughter would be too intimidated, too poor, and too beaten down to fight a protracted legal battle against a wealthy tech CEO. He expected me to absorb the debt, declare bankruptcy, and perhaps even face jail time for financial fraud, all while he walked away with clean hands. He had weaponized my identity to fund his ego, effectively tossing me onto the tracks to stop his own train wreck. I sat in the coffee shop staring at the digital numbers that represented my ruined financial life. They had stripped me of my family, barred me from my mother's funeral, handed me a fraudulent bill, and now they were preparing to send me to prison for their debts. The sheer suffocating weight of the betrayal threatened to crush my resolve. I threw the untouched coffee into the trash. I walked out into the rain and drove back to my cramped apartment complex. The drive was a blur of gray skies and brake lights. I was backed into a corner, stripped of my resources, holding a negative net worth, and facing an impending legal catastrophe. I climbed the narrow stairwell to my floor, my mind calculating defense strategies, drafting emergency fraud alerts, and planning calls to the credit bureaus. I reached my door exhausted and running on adrenaline. I stopped. Resting on the welcome mat directly in front of my door was a rectangular package. It was a standard FedEx shipping box sealed tight with heavy reinforced tape. The cardboard was slightly damp from the humidity. I did not order anything. I bent down and inspected the shipping label. The sender's name was printed in clear block letters, Clara Evans. My breath caught. Clara was the registered private nurse Julian had hired to care for my mother during the final 3 years of her battle with Alzheimer's. She was the woman who managed the medications, monitored the vitals, and stood watch in the Mercer Island estate while the family carried on with their lives. I had spoken to her in brief, hushed whispers over the years' interactions hidden from Julian and Nia's watchful eyes. I picked up the heavy package. It felt substantial, dense, like it contained a stack of hardcover books or thick binders. I unlocked my door and carried the box inside, setting it down on the center of my small kitchen island. My financial life was in ruins. My brother had just signed my death warrant in the form of an $85,000 fraudulent loan. But looking at the brown cardboard box, sent by a woman who had lived inside the walls of the enemy's fortress, a new variable entered the equation. I reached into the kitchen drawer and pulled out a sharp utility knife. I sliced through the reinforced tape, cutting the seal with a slow, deliberate motion. The box opened, revealing its contents, and the entire trajectory of the war shifted. I was no longer just a victim of identity theft. I was about to become the architect of their destruction. The contents were wrapped carefully in protective bubble wrap, an extra layer of security that told me Clara understood the value of what she was sending. I pulled the wrapped bundle from the cardboard shell. The weight of it was grounding. My analytical mind, trained to process chaos into structured datasets, immediately recognized that whatever Clara had compiled, it was not a fleeting emotional apology. It was documentation. It was evidence. Julian believed he held all the cards because he controlled the estate, the narrative, and the fraudulent loans. He did not realize that true power does not reside in stolen credit limits or spoken eulogies. True power resides in the raw, unedited logs of human behavior. I set the knife down and began to unwrap the plastic. The first piece of the puzzle was about to reveal itself. I tore the bubble wrap away, the plastic popping loud in the quiet kitchen. Beneath the protective layers lay two items: a heavy black leather-bound ledger, the kind accountants used decades ago before everything went digital, and a small silver USB drive tucked neatly beside it. Attached to the cover of the black ledger was a square yellow sticky note. The handwriting was sharp, rigid, and deeply practical. It belonged to Clara. I recognized the script from the medication charts I used to glance at when I snuck into the house. I read the words written in black ink. Naomi. She did not remember her own name at the end. She did not know who I was or where she was living. But every Tuesday and Thursday evening, when you slipped through the side door while the others were away at their galas and dinners, she smiled. She always smiled when you stroked her hair. Do not let them twist the truth. I stared at the sticky note. My throat tightened, a sudden sharp ache threatening to break my composure. Clara knew. The private nurse had known for 3 years that the exiled daughter was quietly violating the rules of her banishment, breaking into her own childhood home just to sit beside a dying woman who could no longer recognize her. Clara had never reported me to Julian. She had simply looked the other way. Answering the side door remained unlocked on the nights she knew Julian and Nia were attending high society networking events. I peeled the sticky note off the cover and opened the heavy leather ledger. The pages were dense with meticulously organized columns. This was not a diary of feelings or a collection of sentimental thoughts. It was a clinical, unyielding medical logbook. Clara was a professional. She operated on precision. The pages documented 1,095 days of care. Every dose of medication administered, every change in vitals, every meal consumed, and crucially, every single visitor who crossed the threshold of the Mercer Island estate. I flipped to a random date in the middle of the ledger. A Tuesday in November 2 years ago. The columns were perfectly aligned. Vitals checked at 8 in the morning. Lunch served at noon. Medication administered at 4 in the afternoon. And in the far right column, under the heading Visitor Log, written in Clara's rigid script, was my name. Naomi. Arrival, 7:15 in the evening. Departure, 8:30 in the evening. Notes, sat with patient. Patient rested comfortably. I turned the pages faster, scanning the visitor column week by week, month by month. The pattern was undeniable. Tuesday Naomi, Thursday Naomi, Tuesday Naomi, Thursday Naomi. 2 days a week, every single week for 3 years. The eulogy Julian delivered at the cemetery, the narrative he had spun for the wealthy investors and family friends, claiming I had abandoned my mother to die in profound isolation. The lie was entirely dismantled by the ink on these pages. This ledger was the ultimate alibi, a verified continuous record maintained by an independent medical professional. It proved I was the only one who consistently showed up when the cameras were off and the social points were zero. The emotional relief of validation was brief. The data analyst inside me took over. I possessed my alibi. Now, I needed to audit the opposition. I returned to the first page of the ledger, resetting my parameters. I began a new search this time, scanning the visitor column for a different name. I looked for Julian, the son who stood at the podium and wept over his mother's casket, the CEO who painted himself as the devoted, grieving caretaker. I expected to find a sporadic record of visits, perhaps dropping in once a month or on holidays. I expected a display of minimal effort, dressed up as profound sacrifice. I flipped through the first 6 months. The visitor column remained empty next to the dates bearing his name. I pushed through the first year. Nothing. The pages covering the second year blurred past my eyes. Still nothing. The sheer emptiness of the logbook was staggering. The man who lived less than 20 miles away, who controlled the estate's finances and dictated my mother's care plan, was a ghost in her actual life. I finally found his name in the third year. It appeared exactly 3 times. In 1,095 days of a terminal illness, the devoted son had crossed the threshold of his mother's home on only 3 occasions. My initial reaction was a cold, hard anger at his hypocrisy. But as I stared at the 3 isolated dates recorded in Clara's sharp handwriting, the anger shifted into intense, calculated scrutiny. Why those 3 days? People like Julian do not perform random acts of familial duty. Every action is a transaction. Every visit is calculated for a return on investment. He did not visit his mother out of a sudden pang of guilt or a burst of affection. He visited her because he needed something from her on those specific dates. I grabbed a notepad and a pen from my kitchen counter. I wrote down the 3 dates extracted from Clara's ledger: February 12th, August 14th, October 20th. The dates sat isolated on the lined paper, lacking context. To a casual observer, they were just random days in a calendar year. To a data analyst, they were anomalies demanding investigation. They were spikes in a dormant baseline. I needed to cross-reference these dates against external datasets to understand their significance. I picked up the silver USB drive Clara had included in the package. I plugged it into the side of my laptop. A single folder appeared on the screen labeled simply Financials. I clicked the folder. It contained dozens of high-resolution scanned PDF documents. I recognized the format immediately. They were my mother's old banking statements, investment portfolio summaries, and legal correspondence. Clara had not just maintained a medical log. She had been quietly photographing the mail and financial documents Julian carelessly left scattered on the kitchen counter during his rare visits. She had been building a parallel archive of his activities. I opened the first PDF file, a comprehensive summary of my mother's primary retirement account. I minimized the window, aligning it next to the notepad displaying the 3 dates from the medical ledger. I initiated a chronological trace, matching the dates of Julian's visits against the timeline of my mother's financial transactions. I needed to see if the physical movements correlated with the digital money trail. I needed to connect the ghost in the house to the ghost in the machine. The first date on my notepad was February 12th. I opened Clara's ledger to the corresponding entry. The notes section was unusually detailed. Julian arrived 10 in the morning. Requested nurse to leave the room. Private conversation. Patient appeared highly agitated following departure. Elevated heart rate. Required additional medication to stabilize. I shifted my eyes to the digital bank statements on my screen, scanning the transactions for the month of February. I scrolled down to the week of the 12th. My pulse hitched. The correlation was exact. On February 12th, the same day, Julian demanded the nurse leave the room. The same day. He left my mother agitated and distressed. A massive withdrawal was initiated from her primary retirement portfolio. The amount was staggering, $400,000. The funds were liquidated and transferred into a secondary holding account, the details of which were obscured on the summary statement. Julian had not visited his mother to check on her declining health. He had visited her to secure authorization for a massive capital extraction. He had pressured a woman suffering from advanced cognitive decline into signing away nearly $500,000 of her security net. The anger I felt earlier was eclipsed by a chilling realization. This was not mere neglect. This was financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The first date had yielded a devastating discovery. The pattern was established. I looked down at the second date written on my notepad. August 14th. I turned the heavy pages of the black leather ledger, searching for the corresponding entry. The dread pooled heavy in my stomach. I knew whatever I found on that date would not be a simple withdrawal. The stakes were escalating. Julian was bleeding the estate dry, and I was tracking his surgical strikes in real time. I found the page for August. I traced my finger down to the 14th. The notes waiting for me in Clara's rigid script would push the conflict past the point of no return. I shifted my focus to the second date on the notepad. August 14th. I set up my workstation, connecting a secondary monitor to my laptop. On the left screen, I displayed Clara's digital scans of the financial documents. On the right, I kept the medical ledger open. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was a forensic data analyst dissecting a hostile takeover. I traced Clara's rigid handwriting down the page for August 14th. The entry was stark, clinical, and horrifying. Patient administered heavy dosage of prescribed sedatives following a severe night terror episode. Patient unresponsive to verbal stimuli. Total loss of cognitive awareness. Julian arrived at 2 p.m, accompanied by an unidentified male carrying a leather briefcase. Requested nurse remain in the kitchen. Visitors departed at 2:45. Patient remained comatose throughout the duration. I stared at the words. Unresponsive. Total loss of cognitive awareness. I turned my attention to the left screen, parsing through the PDF files Clara had managed to photograph during Julian's careless visits. I found a document dated mid-September, a legal summary from the estate attorney's office. I zoomed in on the opening paragraph. It referenced the execution of 2 critical documents, a revised last will and testament, and a comprehensive power of attorney. I checked the execution date listed on the legal summary, August 14th. The air in my apartment felt suddenly thin. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening crunch. Julian had not arrived to comfort a sedated mother. He had arrived with a lawyer or a notary in tow. He had walked into the bedroom of a woman heavily drugged on sedatives, a woman entirely incapable of understanding her own name, let alone complex legal jargon. He had taken her limp, unresponsive hand, wrapped her fingers around a pen, and physically guided it across the signature lines of documents designed to strip me of my inheritance and grant him absolute unchecked control over her entire estate. The audacity was staggering. The sheer predatory calculation of waiting until she was medically incapacitated to execute a legally binding document crossed the line from greed into outright criminal elder abuse. The revised will, Julian had shoved through the iron gate. The document that erased me from the family legacy was a complete fabrication born of coercion and heavy narcotics. He thought he was untouchable. He assumed the medical records were locked away in a doctor's office, inaccessible to the exiled daughter. He never considered that the quiet nurse standing in the kitchen was documenting the exact cognitive state of the signatory at the precise moment the ink met the paper. I logged the second correlation on my notepad. The pattern of exploitation was no longer a theory. It was a documented timeline of criminal activity. Julian was systematically dismantling our mother's life, timing his strikes to coincide with her most vulnerable moments. I moved to the final date on the list, October 20th. This date stood out because it occurred a mere 2 weeks before my mother passed away. She was in hospice care by then, her body failing rapidly. Julian had extracted the $400,000 in February. He had secured the power of attorney and the forged will in August. The financial and legal takeover of the estate was already complete. Why would he return? What was left to take? I flipped to the final pages of the black ledger. The entries in October were somber, detailing the slow decline of vital signs. I found the entry for the 20th. The handwriting here was hurried, pressing deeper into the paper, reflecting Clara's evident distress. Julian arrived at 11 a.m, accompanied by Naya. First time Nia has visited the premises in over 2 years. They did not enter the patient's bedroom. They proceeded directly to the primary study. 10 minutes later, a commercial locksmith arrived in an unmarked van. Locksmith spent 45 minutes in the study. Loud drilling sounds. Julian and Nia departed with 2 heavy canvas bags. did not look in on the patient before leaving. The description hit me with the force of a physical blow. Nia, the woman who stood by the grave in a custom mourning dress. The woman who recorded my public humiliation for social media sympathy. The woman who wore my mother's vintage pearl necklace while sneering at me from the porch. She had not visited a dying woman to offer comfort. She had not come to say goodbye. She had come to orchestrate a heist. The primary study in the Mercer Island estate housed a massive floor-mounted steel safe. It was a relic from my father's era, impenetrable without the combination. My mother kept her most valuable physical assets locked inside: heirloom jewelry, untraceable bearer bonds, and a significant reserve of physical gold my parents had accumulated during the dot-com boom. Julian had the power of attorney granting him access to the digital bank accounts and the investment portfolios. But a power of attorney does not magically reveal the combination to a mechanical safe. He needed brute force. He and Nia had hired a professional locksmith, likely paying him a premium in untraceable cash to ask no questions. They had cracked the safe open while the owner lay dying in the next room. They had looted the physical wealth of the estate, stuffing generations of accumulated assets into canvas bags like common burglars, clearing out a jewelry store at midnight. They did not even possess the basic human decency to peek their heads into the bedroom to check if the woman they were robbing was still breathing. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Nia had orchestrated the theft of the vintage pearl necklace from the safe. She had draped the stolen heirloom around her own neck, a trophy of her successful pillaging, and then wore it to parade her dominance over me at the front gate. She was not a grieving daughter-in-law. She was a scavenger picking the bones of a dying woman clean. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the dual monitors casting sharp shadows across my face. I had unraveled the entire operation. I had the timeline, the medical context, and the financial correlations. Julian and Nia were not brilliant masterminds. They were clumsy, arrogant thieves who left a trail of obvious clues because they believed they operated in a vacuum devoid of consequences. They thought their wealth and social standing provided an impenetrable shield. They were wrong. They had left a massive, glaring vulnerability exposed in their hasty, illegal maneuvers. I zoomed in on the scanned copy of the revised will Julian had provided. My eyes drifted past the jagged, coerced signature of my mother. I focused on the bottom of the page where the legal authority of the document was supposedly cemented. Beneath the signature line sat the bright red stamp of the Notary Public. The seal that certified the signer was of sound mind, acting without duress, and fully understood the legal implications of the document. The seal that was legally required to make the forged will binding in a court of law. I read the name printed on the notary stamp: Derek Vance. I did not know the name, but a forensic data analyst knows that every seal has a digital footprint. Every notary is registered with the state. Every license has a history. Julian had brought someone with him on August 14th to witness the coercion. He had brought someone willing to risk their own freedom to validate a fraudulent document. I opened a new tab on my browser. I connected to the state licensing database. I was going to find out exactly who Derek Vance was, and I was going to use his red stamp to blow Julian's entire criminal enterprise into dust. I cropped the image of the notary seal from the scanned PDF, isolating the bright red ink. Derek Vance. The name was stamped clearly above a faded commission expiration date. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to the official portal for the Washington State Department of Licensing. I needed to verify the credentials of the man who had supposedly witnessed my mother, while comatose on heavy sedatives, sign away her entire estate. I entered the name and the commission number into the public database. The search engine buffered for 3 seconds. To a data analyst, 3 seconds is an eternity. It is the agonizing pause before the algorithm delivers a verdict. The results loaded onto the screen. I read the status line: license revoked. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I clicked on the detailed disciplinary action report attached to his file. The state does not revoke a notary commission for minor clerical errors. They revoke it for severe ethical breaches. The public record was damning. 2 years ago, Derek Vance had been formally stripped of his notary credentials following a state investigation. He was found guilty of accepting cash bribes to authenticate fraudulent real estate transfers and backdate legal documents for shell companies. He had narrowly avoided federal prison by cooperating with investigators, but he was permanently barred from executing any legal documents in the state of Washington. The implications hit me with the force of a physical strike. Julian had not just coerced an incapacitated woman into signing a will. He had hired a disgraced, unlicensed fraudster to stamp the document. The revised last will and testament, the very paper Julian had used to legally lock me out of the Mercer Island estate and claim the $2.8 million inheritance, was legally worthless. It was a fabricated piece of trash carrying the seal of a known criminal. The sheer arrogance of the maneuver was breathtaking. Julian, the polished CEO who mingled with venture capitalists, had committed a blatant felony. He believed his wealth and his carefully crafted narrative of the grieving son provided an impenetrable shield. He assumed that because he had successfully exiled the analytical daughter, no one else in the family or the legal system would ever bother to run a basic background check on the notary stamp. He was incredibly confident and incredibly stupid. But a deeper question lingered. Why use a disgraced notary? Julian had enough money to hire any corrupt licensed attorney in Seattle who operated in the gray areas of estate law. Why risk using a man with a public disciplinary record? It was an unnecessary vulnerability. I needed to map the human connections. I opened a secondary monitor and launched a deep dive search across social media platforms, public property records, and background check databases. I fed the name Derek Vance into the algorithm, cross-referencing it against the immediate social circles of Julian and Nia. The connection materialized within 20 minutes, buried deep in an old archived Facebook photo album belonging to a distant relative. It was a picture from a backyard barbecue taken 6 years ago. The caption tagged several individuals. Standing near a folding table holding a plastic cup of beer was Derek Vance. Standing directly beside him, laughing and holding his arm, was Nia. I pulled the public family tree records. The data confirmed the visual evidence. Derek Vance was not a random disgraced notary Julian had found in a dark corner of the internet. Derek Vance was Nia's first cousin. The conflict escalated from a simple case of elder abuse into a coordinated closed-loop family conspiracy. Nia, the woman who wore my mother's stolen pearls and directed security to throw me off the property, was the architect of the fraud. She had brought her disgraced cousin into the fold. They had kept the crime entirely within the family to prevent external leaks. Julian and Nia had conspired to use a relative with a history of document fraud to finalize the theft of my mother's estate, ensuring the money flowed directly into their accounts without alerting a single legitimate legal professional. They had built a fortress of lies, sealing it with a forged red stamp, and stood on top of it, declaring themselves the untouchable victors. They had weaponized my absence, convinced that their narrative of the ungrateful absent daughter would override any minor administrative discrepancies. They failed to understand that data does not care about narratives. Data only cares about facts. And the facts were currently printing out of my laser printer page by page. I spent the next 4 hours assembling the execution file. I worked with the cold, methodical precision of an analyst preparing a final audit report for a hostile board of directors. I printed the high-resolution scans of the bank statements, highlighting the $400,000 withdrawal initiated on February 12th. I printed the corresponding page from Clara's medical ledger detailing my mother's severe agitation and Julian's demand for privacy on the exact same date. I printed the August 14th entry, the clinical proof that my mother was comatose on heavy sedatives on the day she supposedly signed the revised will. I placed it next to the forged will itself. I printed the October 20th entry, the undeniable record of Nia and Julian hiring a locksmith to crack the safe while my mother lay dying in the next room. Finally, I printed the state disciplinary report, confirming Derek Vance's revoked license, placing it side by side with the genealogical record proving his blood relation to Nia. I compiled the documents into a thick manila folder. I did not sleep. The adrenaline surging through my veins burned away any physical exhaustion. I had been stripped of my family, robbed of my inheritance, and pushed to the brink of financial ruin by a brother who thought he was untouchable. I stood by the window of my cramped apartment, watching the sun rise over the Seattle skyline. The gray light filtered through the blinds, illuminating the manila folder resting on my small kitchen table. Julian and Nia had spent the last 7 years controlling the story. They had manipulated my mother, deceived the social elite, and orchestrated a massive financial heist under the guise of family duty. They thought the battle was over. They thought they had buried me. They were about to discover that when you bury a data analyst, you only give them time to dig up the truth. I picked up the folder. I was not going to hire a lawyer. I was not going to send an email. I was going to deliver the audit report in person. The morning air was sharp and unforgiving. I drove my modest sedan toward the exclusive enclave where Julian had built his $4 million glass and steel fortress. The house sat on a ridge projecting modern wealth and sterile arrogance. I parked on the street, leaving the engine running. I did not intend to stay long. I only needed to deliver a message. I grabbed the thick manila folder from the passenger seat. I walked up the floating concrete steps to the oversized pivot front door and pressed the illuminated doorbell. Julian answered within seconds. He wore a navy blue silk robe holding a small porcelain espresso cup in his right hand. He looked exactly like a man who had just stolen $2.8 million and slept perfectly through the night. When he saw me standing on his porch, the initial flicker of surprise was instantly replaced by a smug, condescending smirk. "I thought you were busy dodging collection agencies," Naomi Julian said, taking a slow sip of his espresso. His voice was smooth, carrying the manufactured confidence of a CEO addressing a disgruntled junior employee. "You are violating the cease and desist order. I can have you arrested for trespassing." I did not offer a greeting. I did not engage in the verbal sparring he expected. I pulled the black leather ledger from the manila folder. I did not hand it to him. I shoved it forward, pressing the heavy cover flat against his chest, forcing him to step back or drop his expensive coffee. Julian instinctively grabbed the ledger with his free hand, his brow furrowing in irritation. "What is this garbage?" "It is Clara's medical logbook, Julian," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass exterior of his mansion. "It is a highly detailed chronological record. It documents every dose of medication administered to our mother. It also documents the exact time you arrived on August 14th, accompanied by your disgraced unlicensed notary, to coerce a woman comatose on heavy sedatives into signing away her estate." Julian glanced down at the black book. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant smirk fractured. His facial muscles tightened. The polished facade cracked, revealing the raw, panicked realization that his pristine timeline had been breached. He looked back up at me, his eyes narrowing, assessing the threat level of the sister he had written off as a helpless victim. Before he could formulate a lie, Nia stepped out from the expansive living room, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. She wore a tailored athleisure set, her arms crossed firmly across her chest. She radiated hostility. "What is she doing here, Julian?" Nia demanded, stepping beside her husband. She glared at me, her eyes locking onto the ledger in Julian's hand. "I told him I have the medical records, Nia," I answered, shifting my focus to her. "I also have the background check on your cousin Derek Vance. The state revoked his notary license 2 years ago for fraud. You built your entire legal defense on a forged stamp." Nia did not flinch. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She was a public relations director. She specialized in spinning narratives and burying inconvenient truths. She looked at the ledger, then back at me, her lips curling into a cruel sneer. "Do you really think a ragged little notebook is going to overturn a signed, notarized legal document in a court of law?" Nia asked, her voice dripping with venom. "You have nothing but the scribbles of a disgruntled nurse. We have the estate attorney, the finalized will, and the financial backing to bury you under a mountain of legal fees." Julian recovered his composure, bolstered by his wife's aggressive stance. He looked at the ledger in his hand, then let it drop to the porch floor. The heavy book hit the concrete with a dull thud. He lifted his leather slipper and deliberately stepped onto the cover, grinding the toe of his shoe into the leather. "You are a desperate, mentally unstable woman drowning in $85,000 of commercial debt," Julian said, delivering his lines with chilling precision. "My lawyers will crush you in a deposition. They will paint you as a bitter, indebted sister trying to extort her successful brother after abandoning their dying mother. Who do you think a judge will believe, Naomi? The tech CEO or the bankrupt data analyst with a history of family estrangement? Get off our property before I call the police and have you arrested for extortion," Nia added, pulling her phone from her pocket and holding it up as a threat. They were not panicking. They were not begging for mercy or scrambling to explain the discrepancies. They were leaning into their power, relying on their wealth and their carefully constructed public image to crush any opposition. They believed that money and influence could rewrite reality, that they could simply bully the truth into submission. I looked at the ledger under Julian's foot. I looked at the cold, calculating expressions on their faces. I had delivered the warning. I had shown them the weapon. I did not need to stand on their porch and argue with them. I turned around and walked back down the floating concrete steps. "Good luck with the bankruptcy," Julian called after me, his voice carrying over the sound of my car engine starting. I drove away from the glass mansion, my hands steady on the steering wheel. I had expected resistance, but their absolute refusal to acknowledge the danger they were in confirmed my strategy. They were too arrogant to surrender privately. They needed to be dismantled publicly. I returned to my apartment ready to initiate the next phase of the audit. I needed to compile the evidence into a format that could be submitted directly to federal investigators. But I had underestimated the speed and ferocity of Nia's counterattack. When you corner a public relations director, they do not fight with the lawyers immediately. They fight with the media. At 3 in the afternoon, my phone began to vibrate violently across my desk. It was not a call. It was a barrage of notifications alerts and text messages flooding my screen in rapid succession. I picked up the device, my heart rate accelerating as I read the incoming data. Nia had launched a preemptive, devastating strike. She had leveraged her extensive network of media contacts to detonate a character assassination campaign designed to destroy my credibility before I could even file a police report. She had published an anonymous, highly detailed blind item on a prominent Seattle business blog. The headline was designed for maximum viral impact. Tech CEO extorted by estranged debt-ridden sister immediately following mother's funeral. I clicked the link. The article did not use my name, but the identifying details were unmistakable. It described a tragic family dynamic where a successful founder was being harassed by a sibling suffering from severe financial ruin and mental instability. It detailed the $85,000 commercial loan, the exact debt Julian had fraudulently opened in my name, using it as proof of my desperate financial situation. But the text was not the most destructive element. Embedded in the article was a carefully edited photograph. It was a picture taken from the security cameras at Julian's glass mansion that very morning. It showed me standing on the porch, my face contorted in mid-sentence, thrusting the black ledger aggressively toward Julian. The caption below the image read, "The estranged sister captured on security footage, aggressively demanding money from the grieving family." The narrative was flawless. They had weaponized my attempt to confront them, spinning it into a documented extortion attempt. They used the fake debt they created to establish a motive for my supposed insanity. My phone rang. It was the director of human resources at the data analytics firm where I worked. I answered the call, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Naomi, the director, said, her voice stripped of its usual corporate warmth. "We need you to clear out your desk immediately." I stood up, gripping the edge of my table. "You cannot do this based on a blind item blog post." "It is not just the blog post, Naomi," she replied, her tone sharp and uncompromising. "The article linked your professional profile. Our clients are calling. We deal with highly sensitive financial data. We cannot employ an analyst who is publicly implicated in a violent family extortion plot and severe personal debt. It is a massive liability. You are terminated effective immediately. Security will box up your personal items." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The silence in my small apartment felt heavy, oppressive. In the span of 6 hours, Julian and Nia had escalated the conflict from a family dispute to total annihilation. They had stripped me of my inheritance, saddled me with crippling fraudulent debt, and now they had publicly destroyed my professional reputation and severed my only source of income. They had pushed me to the absolute edge, expecting me to break, expecting me to crawl into a corner and accept defeat. They wanted me to die on the street. They forgot one crucial detail. When you strip a data analyst of their job, their reputation, and their safety net, you do not render them powerless. You give them 24 hours a day to hunt. I opened my laptop, the blue light illuminating my face in the darkening room. I was no longer fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for my survival. And I was going to tear their digital world apart. The article spread through my professional network with the speed of a digital virus. By 5 in the afternoon, my LinkedIn profile was locked due to a surge in abusive messages. By 6, I had received cancellation emails from 2 freelance clients I consulted for on the weekends. Nia had not just launched a smear campaign, she had executed a targeted strike on my livelihood. She understood that a data analyst relies entirely on a reputation for meticulous accuracy and ethical integrity. By branding me an unstable, extorting addict drowning in debt, she rendered me unemployable in my own industry. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the glow of my monitor casting sharp shadows against the walls. The $85,000 commercial loan Julian had fraudulently opened in my name was accumulating interest. My rent was due in 2 weeks. I had no income and no legal access to my mother's estate. If I played by the rules they had established, I would be evicted within a month. I did not cry. Crying is a biological response to overwhelming stress. It offers no tactical advantage. I opened a command line interface on my laptop. Julian and Nia believed they had severed my ability to fight back by cutting off my resources. They believed the battle was over. They failed to realize that the most dangerous opponent is the one who no longer has anything to lose and everything to gain. I needed to find the money. Not the inheritance tied up in the forged will, but the actual liquid assets Julian had drained from my mother's accounts. The $400,000 withdrawn on February 12th. Julian was arrogant, but he was not an idiot. He would not wire stolen funds directly into his failing tech startup. The sudden influx of undocumented capital would trigger red flags during a standard financial audit or an investor due diligence review. He needed to wash the money. He needed to create distance between the theft and the destination. I pulled up the digital copies of my mother's bank statements from the encrypted USB drive Clara had sent. I focused on the transaction ID associated with the massive withdrawal. I needed to trace the routing pathway. I needed to find the receiving entity. Using my deep analytical skills, I accessed public financial databases and utilized specialized tracing software to follow the digital breadcrumbs. The search was complex, requiring me to navigate through layers of obfuscated data. But the architecture of financial transactions always leaves a trail. Money cannot move without a ledger recording its transit. 3 hours later, my eyes burning from the screen, I found the destination. The $400,000 had not been deposited into a traditional banking institution. It had been wired into an account held by a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware is a well-known corporate haven offering stringent privacy laws that shield the identities of business owners. It is the perfect jurisdiction for creating shell companies designed to hide illicit funds. I read the name of the entity on the screen, Nova Vanguard, LLC. The name meant nothing to me. It was generic corporate jargon designed to sound legitimate while revealing absolutely nothing about its operations. I initiated a deep dive into the corporate registry for Nova Vanguard. I needed to penetrate the Delaware Privacy Shield. I needed to identify the managing members. I bypassed the standard public search portals and utilized specialized investigative tools, tapping into interconnected tax filings and registered agent databases. It was a tedious process, requiring me to cross-reference hundreds of data points to isolate the specific digital signature associated with the company's formation. At 2 in the morning, the terminal window returned a match. The software had successfully extracted the name of the managing director and sole owner of Nova Vanguard, LLC. I leaned closer to the monitor. The breath hitched in my throat. The name glowing in bright green text against the black background shattered my understanding of the conspiracy. The sole owner of the shell company holding my mother's stolen money was not Julian. The name on the federal tax documents was Nia. My sister-in-law, the PR director, who had just orchestrated my public destruction, was the sole beneficiary of the embezzlement scheme. The conflict fractured, breaking open a massive chasm in the narrative Julian had constructed. Julian believed he was the mastermind securing his financial future by manipulating his sick mother and exiling his sister. He thought he was moving the stolen funds into a secure offshore holding company to protect it from his startup's creditors. But Nia was running a secondary parallel operation. She was not just helping her husband steal, she was stealing from her husband. Nia had structured the Delaware Shell Company so that she held absolute legal control over the assets. If Julian's tech startup officially went bankrupt, his creditors could not touch Nova Vanguard because his name was nowhere on the formation documents. But more importantly, if their marriage dissolved or if Julian was indicted for elder fraud, Nia controlled the stolen millions. She had successfully insulated herself while letting Julian take all the risks of coercing my mother and forging the documents. Julian was a thief, but Nia was an apex predator. She had built a financial lifeboat for herself using my mother's money and left her husband standing on a sinking ship. The implications were staggering. They were not a united front. They were two greedy individuals operating on a fragile foundation of mutual deception. Julian did not know his wife had secured sole ownership of the stolen funds. Nia did not know that I had just uncovered her secret betrayal. I smiled. The cold, hard smile of an analyst who has just found the critical flaw in the enemy's code. I did not need to fight their expensive lawyers. I did not need to defend myself against the social media mob. I just needed to introduce this specific piece of data into their household and watch them tear each other apart. I compiled the formation documents for Nova Vanguard, highlighting Nia's name as the sole managing member. I cross-referenced it with the wire transfer logs proving the stolen $400,000 had funded the LLC. I created a clean, undeniable presentation of Nia's hidden financial empire. I saved the dossier onto a secure external drive. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the Seattle skyline. I had been fired from my job. I had been humiliated in public. I had been burdened with crushing fraudulent debt. But sitting in my dark apartment holding the evidence of their internal betrayal, I knew the war was about to turn. I was not going to send an email. I was going to deliver the bomb in person. The digital hunt consumed me entirely. Stripped of my employment and legally barred from my family, I had nothing but 24 unbroken hours a day to dissect their crimes. I sat in the center of my dark apartment, the only illumination radiating from the stark blue light of my dual monitors. I plugged the silver USB drive Clara had sent into a secure port. I needed to move beyond the $400,000 extraction from February. I needed to locate the remaining balance of the estate, the $2.8 million Julian had claimed total control over through the forged will. I opened the folder containing Clara's clandestine photographs. She had captured dozens of documents Julian had carelessly left strewn across the kitchen island during his rare visits. Amidst the medical bills and generic junk mail, I found a series of complex wire transfer confirmation receipts. I zoomed in on the grainy images. The transfers were massive, moving hundreds of thousands of dollars in rapid succession out of my mother's primary wealth management accounts. I cross-referenced the dates on the receipts with Clara's medical ledger. The transfers initiated exactly 2 days after Julian had forced my comatose mother to sign the revised will and the power of attorney. He had not waited for her to die. He had began liquidating the estate while she was still breathing in the next room. I traced the destination routing numbers printed on the blurry receipts. Julian had repeatedly claimed to investors and family members that he was injecting personal capital into his struggling tech startup to keep it afloat. He used the narrative of the dedicated self-funding founder to buy time with his creditors. But the data told a radically different story. I ran the routing sequences through financial tracking software. The $2.8 million had not touched a single account associated with Julian's startup. The funds had bypassed his business entirely, flowing directly into the corporate accounts of the Delaware Shell Company I had identified earlier. Nova Vanguard, LLC. The entire estate, the culmination of my parents' life work, had been quietly funneled into a corporate black hole designed specifically to hide assets. I leaned closer to the screen, my mind racing through the implications. I had already established that Nia was the sole registered owner of Nova Vanguard. But the sheer volume of the theft required a closer look at the corporate structure. I needed to confirm the exact nature of her control over the stolen funds. I accessed a premium subscription-based corporate intelligence database utilizing the last of my available credit. I pulled the comprehensive operating agreement and the ultimate beneficial ownership records for Nova Vanguard. The documents loaded slowly, line by line of dense legal text. I scrolled past the generic boilerplate clauses and located the section detailing executive authority and asset distribution. I read the paragraphs carefully, parsing the legal jargon with the trained eye of a data analyst. The structure was ironclad. Nia was not just the managing director. She possessed absolute unilateral control over all capital held within Nova Vanguard. The operating agreement explicitly stated that no funds could be dispersed, transferred, or invested without her direct personal authorization. Furthermore, the company was structured as a standalone entity, completely insulated from any marital assets or joint liabilities. The reality of the situation hit me with devastating force. Julian, in his arrogance and desperation to hide the stolen money from his aggressive creditors, had entrusted his wife to set up the offshore holding accounts. He believed they were partners in crime, a unified front securing their wealthy future. He thought the money was safe in a corporate vault they controlled together. He was spectacularly wrong. Nia had not set up a joint holding company. She had built a private financial fortress entirely in her own name. She had successfully engineered a massive money laundering pipeline, siphoning the entire $2.8 million estate directly into an account where Julian had absolutely zero legal access. The thief had been robbed by his own accomplice. Nia had recognized that Julian's tech startup was a sinking ship. She saw the crushing debts and the desperate illegal maneuvers he was making. She knew that if his company collapsed, the creditors would come after everything he owned. She was not going to let herself be dragged down into bankruptcy with him. She had used Julian to execute the dirty work. He was the one who had coerced my mother. He was the one who had hired the disgraced notary. He was the one taking all the legal risks of elder abuse and fraud. Nia had simply positioned herself at the end of the pipeline, holding the bucket wide open to catch the cash. If Julian was indicted, he would face the federal charges alone, while the money remained safely locked behind Nia's corporate firewall in Delaware. She had flawlessly executed a secondary heist, stealing the stolen goods from under her husband's nose. They were not a perfect, untouchable power couple. They were two ravenous sharks trapped in the same tank, waiting for the other to bleed. I sat back in my chair, a cold, hard sense of satisfaction settling over me. The smear campaign Nia had launched against me, the fabricated story of the unstable, extorting sister, was a desperate smokescreen. She needed me discredited and removed from the equation immediately because she knew I had the analytical skills to find the money. She was terrified I would expose her private vault before she could finalize her exit strategy. I did not need to fight their expensive lawyers. I did not need to issue public denials or defend my character on social media. I had something far more destructive than a good reputation. I had the detonator to their marriage. I compiled the definitive proof of Nia's unilateral control over Nova Vanguard. I highlighted the clauses in the operating agreement that explicitly excluded Julian from accessing the funds. I paired the documents with the wire transfer receipts, proving the entire estate had been swallowed by her private company. I created a complete, undeniable dossier of her betrayal. I saved the files onto a secure external drive. The tension that had gripped my chest for days finally released. I was no longer the victim scrambling to survive. I was the architect of their implosion. I was going to hand Julian the exact weapon he needed to destroy his own wife, and I was going to watch their glamorous, fraudulent life burn to the ground from a safe distance. Thursday morning arrived with a brittle, freezing fog rolling off Puget Sound. I had barely slept, running on adrenaline and cold coffee. I left my apartment to buy basic provisions at a discount grocery store a few miles away. I needed to maintain a routine to act as though I was simply a desperate, unemployed woman trying to survive the week. I pushed a small shopping cart across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot toward my aging sedan. I unlocked the trunk and began loading the cheap groceries. The loud screech of high-performance tires braking hard on wet pavement shattered the quiet morning. A massive, matte black SUV swerved aggressively across the parking lanes, cutting off my exit route. The vehicle jerked to a halt, the heavy front grille stopping mere inches from the bumper of my car. It was an unmistakable display of physical intimidation. The driver's side door swung open, and Julian stepped out into the freezing fog. He did not look like the confident tech CEO who had delivered our mother's eulogy. The tailored cashmere and the arrogant smirk were gone. He wore a dark, wrinkled overcoat. Deep purple shadows bruised the skin under his eyes, and his jaw was covered in heavy, dark stubble. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He looked hunted. I knew exactly why he was unraveling. The creditors backing his failing startup were tightening the noose, demanding the capital he had promised them, capital he believed was sitting safely in offshore accounts, entirely unaware that Nia held the only key. Naomi. Julian's voice was a low, dangerous rumble stripped of any familial pretense. He walked slowly toward me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. I closed the trunk of my car and turned to face him, keeping my back pressed against the cold metal. I did not run. I waited. "You are a very persistent problem," he said, stopping 2 feet away. He invaded my personal space, towering over me. "You have been digging into accounts and corporate registries that do not concern you. You are causing friction where there does not need to be any." He pulled his hand from his pocket and threw a thick, stapled legal document onto the hood of my car. It landed with a heavy slap against the metal. "I have a final offer for you," Julian stated, his tone shifting from threat to cold negotiation. "It is a very generous offer considering the damage you have already tried to cause this family." I looked down at the document. The bold heading across the first page read, "Non-disclosure and settlement agreement." "You are going to sign this NDA today," Julian ordered. "You will formally waive any and all rights to contest the revised will. You will permanently cease all inquiries into the estate's finances. In exchange, I will personally pay off the $85,000 commercial loan and zero out the credit card debts that are currently ruining your life. Furthermore, I will wire $100,000 in untraceable cash into an account of your choosing." He leaned closer, planting both hands flat on the hood of my car, trapping me between his arms. The scent of stale coffee and stale sweat emanated from him. "You take the money and you leave Seattle," he whispered, his voice laced with absolute malice. "You disappear. You never contact me, Nia, or anyone in our social circle again." I stared at the thick legal document on the hood. He was offering me a way out of the financial grave he had dug for me. He was offering to clear the fraudulent debts and hand me enough cash to start over in a new city. It was the classic tactic of a wealthy predator: crush the victim into total desperation, then offer a cheap conditional lifeline to secure their permanent silence. "And if I refuse your generous offer, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice quiet. Julian's face hardened into a mask of pure cruelty. "If you refuse, the blind item Nia published about you last week will look like a glowing recommendation. I will ensure every tech firm, every auditing agency, and every corporate recruiter on the West Coast receives a detailed, fabricated dossier proving you are a violent, unstable corporate spy. You will never work in data analysis again. You will be permanently unemployable, bankrupt, and facing felony fraud charges for the loans you supposedly defaulted on." The threat was explicit and devastating. He was promising to completely annihilate my future. He was squeezing the vice around my neck, demanding total surrender. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute power to lower his guard completely. I allowed my shoulders to slump. I broke eye contact, looking down at the wet asphalt. I forced a tremor into my voice, letting out a small, ragged breath that sounded exactly like defeat. I cannot just take a wire transfer, Julian," I stammered, wrapping my arms around myself as if trying to hold my shattered nerves together. "My accounts are flagged. If $100,000 suddenly appears, the bank will freeze it immediately. I will have nothing." Julian rolled his eyes, a sharp sound of irritation escaping his lips. "You are exhausting, Naomi." "Fine. I will bring a certified cashier's check." "And I want a lawyer present," I pleaded, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "I want to sign the NDA legally with a witness. I want to make sure you actually clear the debts before I sign away my rights. I want to do this at Mr. Sterling's office. He is the probate attorney handling Mom's estate. He is neutral." Julian studied my face, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. He saw a broken, terrified woman clinging to the illusion of legal protection. He saw exactly what his ego demanded to see. A slow, victorious smirk spread across his exhausted features. He had broken the stubborn, analytical sister. He had forced her to capitulate. "Fine," Julian said, stepping back and pulling his hands off my car. "Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock at Sterling's office. Do not be late, Naomi, and do not bring any more of your pathetic little logbooks." He turned around, walked back to his massive SUV, and climbed inside. The engine roared and he reversed aggressively out of the parking lot, leaving me standing alone in the freezing fog. I watched his vehicle disappear down the street. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. My posture straightened. The terrified, defeated expression vanished from my face. I reached up and tapped the screen of the sleek black smartwatch strapped to my left wrist. The device chimed softly, confirming the high-definition audio recording had been securely saved and encrypted. Julian thought he had bullied me into signing away my life. He had no idea he had just handed me a pristine digital confession of extortion, blackmail, and witness tampering. He had just provided the exact leverage I needed to destroy his legal defense before he even stepped into the probate attorney's office. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, I was not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I was going to hand Julian the match, and I was going to watch him set his own life on fire. I did not drive back to my apartment after the encounter in the parking lot. I had Julian's extortion recorded the medical ledger, confirming the coercion, and the offshore routing numbers, exposing the theft. I had the motive, the timeline, and the financial data. But to completely dismantle their legal defense and ensure catastrophic failure in a probate court, I needed the final, undeniable proof that the foundational documents were fraudulent. I needed a confession from the man who wielded the fake red stamp. I entered the address I had traced for Derek Vance into my GPS. The route took me far from the manicured lawns of Mercer Island, deep into a dilapidated residential zone near the industrial shipyards. The neighborhood was a bleak stretch of cracked sidewalks and fading multi-unit apartment complexes. I parked my sedan across the street from a drab 2-story building with peeling paint and an overflowing dumpster sitting near the entrance. I checked the apartment number I had extracted from the public records, Unit 4B. I walked up the exterior metal staircase, the structure groaning under my weight. The hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke and damp carpet. I stopped in front of the door for Unit 4B. The numbers were crooked, held on by cheap adhesive. I did not hesitate. I knocked 3 times loud and sharp, the kind of knock that demands an answer. A minute passed. I knocked again, harder this time. I heard the sound of a deadbolt clicking, followed by the rattle of a security chain. The door opened a few inches. A man's face appeared in the narrow gap. Derek Vance looked exactly like a man whose professional life had collapsed 2 years prior. He was in his late 30s, wearing a stained gray t-shirt. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, his jaw covered in days of uneven stubble. The air escaping from the apartment smelled strongly of cheap beer and unwashed clothes. "Yeah. What do you want?" Derek grumbled, his voice thick with sleep or a hangover. I did not offer a polite greeting. I pushed the door slightly, testing the tension on the security chain. "My name is Naomi," I stated, keeping my tone crisp and authoritative. "I am here to talk about the power of attorney you notarized for my mother on August 14th. Derek's bloodshot eyes widened fractionally. The hazy confusion vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline. He recognized the date. He recognized the implications. "I do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, attempting to slam the door shut. I slammed my heavy boot firmly into the gap, wedging it against the doorframe before the wood could connect. The door bounced back, hitting the security chain with a loud metallic clank. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a high-resolution color-printed photograph. I held it up right in front of his face. It was a screenshot of the digital transaction logs I had extracted from the Delaware Corporate Registry. "This is the routing summary for Nova Vanguard, LLC," I said, my voice cold and clinical. "It is a shell company solely owned by your cousin Nia. The company is currently holding $2.8 million stolen from my mother's estate." Derek stared at the numbers on the paper, his jaw going slack. "I know your notary commission was permanently revoked 2 years ago by the state licensing board for accepting bribes." I continued, leaning closer to the gap in the door. "I know stamping a legal document without a valid license is a Class C felony. I also know that conspiring to commit elder fraud and participating in a multi-million-dollar estate theft elevates that charge to a federal offense." Derek swallowed hard. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, glistening under the dim hallway light. I do not know anything about any money," he rasped, his voice trembling. "Nia just asked me for a favor. She said it was a family emergency. I did not let him hide behind ignorance. How much did she pay you, Derek?" I demanded, my tone unwavering. 5,000, 10,000. How much is a federal prison sentence worth to you these days? I did not do anything wrong. Derek pleaded, his eyes darting frantically down the empty hallway, as if expecting federal agents to appear from the shadows. The document was already signed when I got there. I just stamped it. Nia said it was just a formality to help her husband with some business debts he was breaking. The cowardice of a low-level fraudster is the easiest vulnerability to exploit. They fold at the first sign of serious consequences, desperate to save themselves by throwing anyone else under the bus. I pulled a second document from my pocket, the printed disciplinary report detailing the revocation of his license. "The FBI does not care about formalities, Derek," I said, tapping the paper against the doorframe. "They care about wire fraud. If I hand this file to the federal prosecutor, you will take the fall for the entire conspiracy. Julian and Nia will hire expensive defense attorneys and claim you acted alone to extort them. You will spend a decade in a federal penitentiary while your cousin spends the stolen money in Aspen." Derek's breathing became rapid and shallow. The realization that he was the disposable pawn in a multi-million-dollar heist crashed over him. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "I want the truth," I stated flatly. "I want to know exactly what Nia paid you to backdate that fraudulent stamp. If you tell me the truth right now, I will leave your name out of the initial report I send to the FBI. You might be able to negotiate an immunity deal if you testify against them. If you lie to me, I send the file tonight." Derek looked at the printed transaction logs, then at my uncompromising expression. He made the only choice a desperate coward can make. He surrendered. 15,000, he confessed, his voice barely audible. "Nia paid me $15,000 in cash. She brought the papers to my apartment. The signature was already on them. She told me to stamp them and backdate the entry to August 14th. She said her husband needed to secure his mother's assets quickly before a complicated sibling interfered. He admitted it. He confessed to accepting a cash bribe to validate a forged legal document orchestrated directly by Nia. He provided the motive, the method, and the specific amount of the payout. I reached up and casually brushed a stray strand of hair behind my ear, ensuring my wrist was positioned perfectly. The covert smartwatch strapped to my arm pulsed once, a silent confirmation that the high-definition audio recording had captured every single panicked syllable of his confession. I pulled my boot back, allowing the door to swing free. "Do not leave town, Derek," I said, turning my back on him. "The authorities will be in touch." I walked down the creaking metal stairs and back to my car. I did not look back at the dilapidated apartment building. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and opened my laptop. The arsenal was complete. I had the unedited medical logs proving the coercion and confirming my alibi. I had the digital transaction receipts exposing the embezzlement. I had the corporate registry documents proving Nia was the sole beneficiary of the stolen funds. I had the 4K recording of Julian attempting extortion and threatening my career. And now I had the recorded confession of the disgraced notary, confirming the entire legal foundation of their inheritance claim was a paid forgery orchestrated by his own cousin. I compiled all the files, organizing them meticulously into a single devastating digital dossier. Julian thought he had summoned a broken, desperate sister to a law office to sign a surrender document. He thought he was walking into a routine legal meeting to finalize his hostile takeover. He was actually walking into a probate ambush, and I was bringing the heavy artillery. Friday morning began with a singular, decisive action. At 8 o'clock, I picked up my phone and drafted a text message to Julian. The message consisted of exactly 9 words. "I agree. 2 p.m., Sterling's office." I hit send. I did not wait for a reply. I knew he would interpret the brief, compliant text as total submission. He would view it as the final surrender of a defeated adversary. My next call was to Arthur Sterling. Sterling was the senior partner at a prestigious downtown firm. For 30 years, he had managed my parents' legitimate estate planning before Julian sidestepped him with the forged revised will. Sterling was a traditionalist, a man who valued meticulous documentation and procedural integrity above all else. He had been deeply unsettled by the sudden appearance of the revised will bearing a questionable notary stamp, but he lacked the concrete evidence necessary to formally challenge Julian's authority as the acting executor. I was about to provide him with an avalanche of evidence. "Mr. Sterling," I said when his assistant transferred the call, Julian has requested a formal meeting at your office this afternoon to execute a non-disclosure and settlement agreement regarding the estate. Sterling's voice came through the line, cautious and guarded. I am aware, Naomi. Julian's counsel forwarded a draft of the agreement this morning. I must advise you signing that document will permanently waive your right to contest the revised will. It is a severe concession. I appreciate the warning, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Given the hostile nature of this negotiation, I have one non-negotiable condition for my attendance. I require the entire meeting to be recorded on video. I want a definitive visual record of the execution of these documents to ensure there are no future allegations of coercion from either party. There was a brief pause on the line. Sterling was a seasoned attorney. He understood the strategic value of a recorded session when dealing with contentious family disputes. It protects the integrity of the firm as much as the participants. That is an unusual request for a settlement signing, Sterling noted, but it is not unreasonable. I will have our IT department set up the recording equipment in the primary conference room. Will you be bringing your own legal counsel, Naomi? No, I answered. I will be representing myself. I hung up the phone. I did not need a defense attorney. Defense attorneys negotiate terms. I was not negotiating. At 1:45 in the afternoon, I walked through the heavy glass doors of Sterling's law firm. The reception area projected quiet, intimidating wealth, featuring polished marble floors and abstract artwork. The receptionist directed me to Conference Room A, located at the end of a long, silent corridor. I pushed open the heavy oak door. The conference room was expansive, dominated by a massive, polished mahogany table that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the Seattle skyline, gray and overcast. In the corner of the room, a discreet digital camera on a tripod was angled to capture the entire length of the table. The red recording light blinked steadily. Julian and Nia were already seated on the opposite side of the mahogany expanse. They had dressed for a victory lap. Julian wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his posture relaxed, exuding the smug confidence of a CEO who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover. Nia sat beside him in a cream silk blouse and a cashmere blazer, her expensive jewelry catching the muted light from the windows. They looked like royalty preparing to dismiss a peasant. Seated next to Julian was a man I did not recognize. He wore a pinstriped suit and possessed the slick, predatory demeanor of an aggressive corporate defense attorney. He had his laptop open, his fingers poised over the keyboard. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the table, his hands folded over a thick manila folder. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Julian and the empty chair reserved for me. I took my seat across from my brother. I placed my plain black leather bag on the table. Naomi Sterling began, his voice formal and measured for the benefit of the camera. We are here today at the request of Julian to execute a settlement and non-disclosure agreement. For the record, I have advised you to secure independent legal counsel before signing, and you have declined. Is that correct? That is correct, Mr. Sterling, I replied. Julian's attorney leaned forward, sliding a thick, stapled document across the polished wood. The paper stopped directly in front of me. This is the finalized agreement. The attorney stated, his tone brisk and impatient. The terms are exactly as discussed. You waive all claims against the estate. You agree to a strict non-disparagement clause. In return, my client will initiate the debt consolidation protocol immediately upon execution. I suggest you review it quickly so we can conclude this matter. Nia checked the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist, letting out a sharp, theatrical sigh. Sign it quickly, Naomi. We have a dinner reservation at 6, and the traffic across the bridge is going to be terrible. She looked at me with unvarnished contempt. Her eyes held no pity, only the cold satisfaction of a predator watching its prey bleed out. They believed I had come to this room to surrender. They thought I was broken, drowning in the fraudulent debt Julian had created, and terrified of the media smear campaign Nia had launched. They expected me to pick up a pen sign, away my mother's legacy for a handful of silver, and disappear into the shadows. They did not know that the black leather bag resting on the table did not contain a pen. It contained the meticulously compiled, irrefutable evidence of a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. I looked at the stapled NDA sitting in front of me. I looked at Julian's smug smile. I looked at Nia's impatient glare. I looked at the red, blinking light of the recording camera, ensuring every single reaction in this room would be preserved in high definition. I reached out and placed my hands on the settlement agreement. The silence in the room was absolute, pregnant with the anticipation of my defeat. I did not pick up a pen. I gripped the thick stack of paper with both hands. I pulled my hands in opposite directions, ripping the legal document cleanly in half. The sharp tearing sound echoed loudly across the quiet conference room. I tossed the two torn halves of the settlement agreement back across the table. They fluttered and landed in front of Julian's expensive defense attorney. Julian's smug smile vanished instantly. He sat up straight, his hands gripping the armrests of his leather chair. "What do you think you are doing, Naomi? I am declining your generous offer." "Julian," I said, my voice steady, carrying the precise, chilling authority of a forensic auditor presenting a fatal discrepancy report. "I am not signing your non-disclosure agreement. I am not walking away from the estate. And I am certainly not letting you pay off the fraudulent $85,000 commercial loan you opened in my name using my stolen identity." The defense attorney scoffed, shaking his head. "That is a baseless accusation, Ms. Caldwell. If you intend to throw tantrums instead of negotiating, we are leaving." I ignored the attorney. I reached into my black bag. "I am not negotiating," I stated, pulling out a thick color-printed dossier and placing it squarely on the mahogany table. "I am conducting an audit, and your ledger is bleeding." The torn halves of the settlement agreement lay on the polished mahogany, a physical manifestation of a collapsed negotiation. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted instantly from arrogant expectation to sharp, confused tension. Julian stared at the ripped paper, his jaw working as if trying to formulate a response to a scenario his massive ego had never considered possible. I did not wait for him to speak. I opened the black leather dossier. I extracted the first document, holding it up so the camera in the corner could clearly capture the image before sliding it across the table toward Arthur Sterling. Document 1. I announced, my voice carrying the glacial, unwavering precision of a prosecuting attorney laying out a timeline. "This is a certified copy of the daily medical logs maintained by Clara Evans, the registered private nurse who cared for my mother. I have highlighted the entry for August 14th, the exact date my mother supposedly signed the revised last will and testament and the comprehensive power of attorney." I paused, letting my eyes lock onto Julian's suddenly pale face. The medical log details that my mother suffered a severe night terror episode the previous evening. She was administered a heavy documented dosage of prescribed sedatives. The nurse noted specifically that my mother was entirely unresponsive to verbal stimuli and suffered a total loss of cognitive awareness. Furthermore, the log documents that you, Julian, arrived at the estate at 2 p.m. on that specific day and demanded the nurse leave the immediate area. Julian shot up from his chair. The heavy leather seat scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "That nurse is a disgruntled former employee. She fabricated those notes because I fired her. You cannot prove my mother was incapacitated." Mr. Sterling leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses. He pulled the medical log toward him, his brow furrowing as he read Clara's clinical, precise handwriting. The veteran estate attorney understood immediately that a detailed contemporaneous medical record maintained by a licensed professional was devastating evidence in a probate dispute. "You forged a signature on a document designed to steal an estate," Julian said, ignoring his outburst. "But you made a critical error in your rush to secure the assets. You hired cheap help." I pulled the second document from the dossier. I slid it across the table, positioning it perfectly beside the medical logs. "Document 2, I stated. "This is an official disciplinary report downloaded directly from the Washington State Department of Licensing portal. It details the professional standing of Derek Vance, the notary public, who stamped your revised will." Julian stopped shouting. He froze, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The sudden silence in the room was absolute. As the state records clearly indicate, I continued ensuring every word resonated clearly for the camera's microphone. Derek Vance had his notary commission permanently revoked 2 years ago, following a state investigation into bribery and document fraud. The stamp he used to validate the revised will and the power of attorney is legally void. The documents you filed to seize control of the estate are entirely fraudulent, backed by the seal of an unlicensed criminal. The slick corporate defense attorney sitting next to Julian stopped typing on his laptop. He stared at the state licensing report, his face draining of color. He was an aggressive lawyer, but he was not suicidal. He recognized immediately that he was sitting in a recorded room representing a client actively engaged in massive, provable document fraud. He reached out and pulled the disciplinary report closer, his eyes scanning the state seal and the revocation date. "This is absurd," Nia snapped, slamming her manicured hand flat against the mahogany table. She was desperate to maintain the offensive, refusing to acknowledge the collapsing perimeter. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with venomous defiance. "Do you really think bringing a few printed papers into this office changes anything, Naomi? Julian is the named executor. He holds the power of attorney. We have absolute legal control over the assets and the estate management. You have nothing but baseless accusations." I looked at Nia. I did not flinch at her aggression. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face, a smile born of absolute terrifying certainty. "You are entirely correct, Nia," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous conversational murmur. "Julian holds the fraudulent power of attorney. He seized control of the accounts. He managed the assets. I reached into the dossier one final time. I extracted a thick stack of high-resolution color-printed corporate registry filings and wire transfer receipts. I held them in my hand, feeling the weight of the financial execution I was about to deliver. "He managed the assets perfectly," I said, shifting my gaze from Nia to Julian. "But I have to ask, if Julian is in control of the estate, where exactly did the money go, Nia?" I tossed the thick stack of documents into the center of the table. They fanned out across the polished wood, exposing the complex digital architecture of their betrayal. "Document 3, I announced, tapping my index finger against the top page of the scattered stack. "This is the complete financial tracing of the $2.8 million extracted from the estate's primary wealth management accounts." I looked directly at Julian. The panic in his eyes was acute, but it was the panic of a man worried about getting caught, not a man worried about his money. He still believed the funds were safely secured offshore. "The capital was not injected into your failing tech startup," Julian restated, dismantling his final illusion of control. "It was not routed to the corporate accounts to appease your aggressive creditors." According to the wire transfer logs, the entire $2.8 million was siphoned directly into an account held by a Delaware-registered shell company named Nova Vanguard, LLC. Julian frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. He glanced at Nia, then back to the documents. "Yes," he said, his voice hesitant. "Nova Vanguard is the secure holding entity we established. It is a joint trust for asset protection." I let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humor. A joint trust. I repeated, pulling the specific Delaware formation document from the pile and sliding it directly in front of him. "You should always read the operating agreements before you initiate multi-million-dollar wire transfers, Julian, especially when you delegate the corporate structuring to your wife." Julian stared at the paper. His eyes tracked across the dense legal text, scanning the sections detailing executive authority and ownership distribution. He found the signature line. He found the registered managing member section. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving a pale, sickly pallor. The document clearly stated that Nova Vanguard LLC was registered as a single-member entity. There was only one name listed under the ultimate beneficial ownership clause. It was not a joint venture. It was an impenetrable, isolated financial fortress. "The name on the federal tax documents is Nia," I said, ensuring the microphone captured the revelation. "She holds 100% of the shares. The operating agreement explicitly grants her absolute unilateral control over all capital disbursements. Your name is nowhere on the formation documents, Julian. You have absolutely zero legal access to the stolen $2.8 million. Julian's head snapped up. He stared at Nia with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The realization hit him with the destructive force of a derailed train. He had committed elder abuse. He had forged documents. He had stolen my identity to open fraudulent commercial loans. He had taken all the catastrophic legal risks to orchestrate the heist, and his wife had successfully funneled every single dime into a private account he could not touch. "You told me it was a joint trust," Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mounting rage. "You told me the funds were secured for our mutual protection." Nia stumbled backward, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood. The sophisticated, untouchable public relations director vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate woman scrambling for a defense. "Are you insane, Julian?" Nia shrieked, her voice hitting a hysterical defensive pitch. "Did you honestly think I was going to let you dump nearly $3 million into that dying, pathetic startup of yours? Your creditors would have seized everything within a month. I had to secure the capital. I had to protect my future. I was not going to let you drag me down into bankruptcy because you do not know how to run a business." The betrayal was absolute. The unified front they had projected at the cemetery, the coordinated arrogance they had displayed on their front porch, completely imploded within the span of 30 seconds. They were no longer partners in crime. They were two greedy, desperate predators turning on each other in a confined space. Julian let out a guttural, furious roar. He lunged across the mahogany table. His arm swept outward in a violent, uncontrolled arc, knocking a heavy crystal water pitcher and 2 glasses directly toward Nia. The pitcher shattered against the far wall, sending water and shards of sharp glass exploding across the carpet. Nia screamed, diving away from the table and pressing her back against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She pointed a shaking finger at him. "Do not touch me, you psychotic failure. You are the one who forged the documents. You are the one who stole her identity. I just moved the money. You are the one going to prison." The corporate defense attorney had seen enough. The moment Julian swept the glasses off the table, the lawyer slammed his laptop shut. He shoved his legal pads into his briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. "Mr. Sterling," the defense attorney shouted over the screaming, addressing the senior partner at the head of the table. "Let the record show I am formally withdrawing my representation of Julian Davies, effective immediately. I have no prior knowledge of the fraudulent documents or the financial misconduct presented in this room." The lawyer did not wait for a response. He grabbed his briefcase and bolted for the heavy oak door, fleeing the toxic fallout of his former client's collapsing empire. Arthur Sterling sat frozen, his hands still resting on the manila folder. He had practiced estate law for 3 decades, but the sheer savage intensity of the implosion playing out in his conference room had paralyzed him. Julian ignored the fleeing lawyer. He rounded the table, advancing on his wife with fists clenched, his face contorted with a terrifying homicidal rage. "You stole my money," he bellowed. "I risked everything to get that estate, and you stole it from me. I will destroy you." Nia grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from a side table, holding it up as a weapon. "Try it, Julian. I will hand the offshore routing numbers to the police myself. I will testify that you forced me to set up the shell company. I will watch you rot." I stood at my side of the table, my arms crossed, watching the violent, ugly disintegration of the family that had tried to bury me. I did not intervene. I did not call for security. I let the camera record every desperate threat, every admission of guilt, and every vile insult they hurled at each other. They had spent years building a flawless public image, masking their greed with performative grief. The truth had not just stripped them of their wealth. It had stripped them of their humanity. "Stop it," I finally commanded. My voice was not a shout. It was a sharp, piercing command that cut through the chaos of their screaming match. It carried the absolute, unwavering authority of a person who controlled the entire board. Julian halted his advance. Nia lowered the brass paperweight slightly, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. They both turned to look at me, their faces flushed, their eyes wide with residual panic. "Fighting over the offshore accounts is entirely pointless," I said, looking at them with profound clinical detachment. "Neither of you is going to keep a single dollar of that money." Julian stared at me, his chest heaving as he tried to process my statement. The blind rage that had driven him to attack his wife slowly morphed back into the arrogant, calculating defiance of a wealthy CEO. He believed he still held the structural advantage. He believed the legal system was a labyrinth he could manipulate with enough capital. "Are you threatening me with a civil lawsuit?" Naomi Julian sneered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You think filing a probate dispute is going to get that money back? I will hire a new legal team tomorrow. I will bury this case in injunctions, continuances, and jurisdictional challenges. I will drag this out in civil court for a decade until you are bankrupt from the legal fees. You will never see a dime of that estate." I looked at him, shaking my head with a slow, almost pitying motion. He was still operating under the delusion that we were fighting a localized family dispute over a contested will. He fundamentally misunderstood the scale of the destruction he had initiated. A civil lawsuit, I repeated, letting a cold, humorless smile touch my lips. You think I am here to argue over probate law? I took a deliberate step away from the mahogany table, ensuring there was physical distance between me and the fallout zone. No, Julian, I am not suing you in civil court. I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. Stealing a family inheritance is a civil matter, but stealing a colleague's identity to open $85,000 in fraudulent commercial loans across state lines, coercing an incapacitated, heavily medicated senior citizen to sign legal documents, and laundering $2.8 million through anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware to evade taxation and creditor seizure. I paused, holding eye contact with both of them, ensuring the specific legal terminology landed with absolute clarity. That is not a family dispute. I continued, enunciating every syllable. That is identity theft, that is elder abuse, that is tax evasion, and most importantly, that is federal wire fraud. Nia's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The brass paperweight slipped from her hand and hit the carpet with a dull thud. She understood the implications of the word federal. She was a public relations director. She knew that federal indictments did not end with quiet settlements and sealed records. They ended with perp walks and lengthy prison sentences. I did not file a police report with the local precinct, I said, pointing toward the panoramic window overlooking the Seattle skyline. Local detectives are easily delayed by aggressive defense attorneys. Local judges can be influenced. Julian took a step backward, his back hitting the edge of the conference table. The arrogant defiance completely drained from his face. Yesterday afternoon, I compiled the unedited medical logs, the forged notary records, your recorded extortion attempt, and the complete offshore routing structure of Nova Vanguard. I bypassed the local authorities entirely. I submitted the comprehensive financial dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Cybercrimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a falling building. He had not just robbed his mother and ruined his sister. He had triggered a federal investigation into a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. He was not facing a civil judge. He was facing the full terrifying weight of the United States Department of Justice. You sent the files to the FBI. Nia stammered, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. I did, I confirmed softly. The heavy oak door of the conference room did not simply open. It was thrust inward with violent, uncompromising force. The heavy wood slammed against the interior wall, shaking the framed artwork. 5 heavily armed federal agents surged into the room. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs. They moved with swift, terrifying coordination, instantly dominating the space. Federal agents, nobody move. Keep your hands where we can see them. The lead agent's command was a physical blow, loud and authoritative, instantly neutralizing any thought of resistance. Julian did not attempt to run. The fight completely left his body. He sank slowly to his knees, lacing his fingers behind his head and staring blankly at the floor. The polished tech founder, the man who had stood at a podium and delivered a heartbreaking eulogy to mask his crimes, was reduced to a cowering suspect on a lawyer's carpet. 2 agents moved in, forcing him flat onto his stomach. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed loudly in the silent room. Nia reacted differently. As an agent approached her, she let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled backward against the glass window, thrashing wildly as the agent grabbed her arm. "Get your hands off me!" she screamed, her voice hitting a panicked, unhinged register. "I am a victim here. He forged those documents. I did not know where the money came from. Let me go." The agent ignored her frantic protests. He spun her around with practiced efficiency, pinning her arms behind her back. The steel cuffs locked tightly over the sleeves of her expensive cashmere blazer. Nia sobbed uncontrollably, her curated image shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She was no longer the untouchable elite. She was a handcuffed suspect facing federal racketeering charges. Arthur Sterling sat frozen at the head of the table. He slowly raised his hands, palms open, indicating his complete non-involvement. The agents ignored the elderly lawyer, their focus entirely on securing the two primary targets. The lead agent turned his attention to me. He held a thick file folder in his left hand. "Are you Naomi?" he asked, his tone strictly procedural. "I am," I replied, keeping my hands visible. "We received the digital dossier you provided to the field office," the agent stated, glancing briefly at the camera blinking in the corner of the room. "We have secured federal warrants for the arrest of Julian Davies and Nia Davies on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. We will need you to come down to the field office to provide a formal statement and authenticate the digital files. I will follow you there," I said. I did not look at Julian lying on the floor. I did not look at Nia sobbing against the window. I had nothing left to say to them. I picked up my black leather bag from the mahogany table. I walked straight past the federal agents, past the shattered crystal pitcher, and out the heavy oak door. I left the conference room without a single backward glance, walking away from the wreckage of the family that had tried to bury me. 6 months passed. The wheels of the federal justice system grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. Once the Department of Justice verified the offshore routing numbers and authenticated the forged signatures on the Delaware corporate registry, the illusion of the wealthy tech founder and his brilliant public relations wife shattered into dust. Julian and Nia did not mount a heroic defense in court. Faced with a mountain of unassailable digital evidence, medical logs, and a recorded confession from their own disgraced notary, their high-priced defense attorneys advised them to surrender. They turned on each other during the discovery phase, each desperately attempting to offer the federal prosecutors information to secure a lighter sentence for themselves. The prosecutors declined to offer immunity to either party. They accepted a global plea agreement to avoid the maximum statutory penalties for wire fraud and identity theft. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle on the day of their sentencing. I wore a simple gray suit, my posture relaxed. The judge did not offer leniency. He looked down from the bench and handed each of them an 8-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Julian stood before the judge in a drab institutional uniform. The bespoke charcoal suits and the gold watches were property of the federal government, now seized to pay restitution. His shoulders were slumped, his face hollowed out by months of sleepless terror. Nia stood beside him, her hair pulled back into a severe, unstyled knot. The curated influencer who once mocked me from a mansion porch was gone, replaced by a convicted felon facing nearly a decade behind concrete walls. They were escorted out of the courtroom through a side door in handcuffs. They did not look back at me. I watched the heavy wooden door swing shut, sealing their fate. The criminal convictions triggered a rapid sequence of legal corrections. The probate judge presiding over my mother's estate reviewed the federal indictment, the medical logs, and the evidence of the forged notary stamp. The court struck the fraudulent revised will from the record with a single definitive ruling. My legal inheritance as outlined in the original estate documents was restored. The financial repair required my specialized skills. I gathered the federal court orders, the identity theft declarations, and the arrest records. I submitted the comprehensive data packets to the 3 major credit bureaus and the commercial lending institution that held the $85,000 business loan. One by one, the fraudulent accounts were expunged from my history. The high-limit credit cards vanished from the ledger. The commercial debt was erased. I watched my credit score update on my monitor, climbing steadily back to its flawless 800 baseline. The numbers aligned. The algorithm recognized the truth. The title to the Mercer Island estate transferred cleanly into my name. I drove out to the property one final time. I used my own key to unlock the heavy oak front doors. The house was silent. The expensive furniture remained, but the space felt entirely devoid of life. I walked through the grand living room where Julian and Nia had tried to extort me. I stood in the hallway where my mother had slapped me 7 years ago, calling me a liar and throwing my suitcase into the rain. I felt no attachment to the structure. The walls held no warmth, only the lingering echoes of manipulation and deceit. I did not want to live in a museum dedicated to my own exile. I called a prominent commercial real estate broker. I handed him the keys that same afternoon and instructed him to list the property immediately. The house sold in less than a month to a corporate executive relocating from out of state. The transaction closed smoothly, and $2.8 million wired directly into a secure holding account under my sole control. I did not use the funds to purchase a luxury penthouse or a sports car. Wealth hoarded for the sake of ego is precisely what destroyed my brother. I wanted to build something that would actively dismantle the kind of predators he and his wife chose to be. I established a registered nonprofit organization. I named it the Caregiver Watch Fund. The foundation had a very specific operational mission. It provided free aggressive legal representation and independent forensic accounting services for elderly individuals facing financial exploitation from their own relatives. We funded private investigations to protect vulnerable seniors from the exact type of quiet domestic theft that my mother had endured in her final days. I needed an executive director who understood the precise nature of the battlefield. I arranged a meeting at a quiet downtown cafe. Clara walked in wearing a simple cardigan, her sharp eyes scanning the room until she found me. I ordered 2 coffees and slid a thick employment contract across the table. "I want you to run the foundation, Clara," I said, keeping my tone professional but sincere. "You know how these predators operate behind closed doors. You know how to spot the signs of coercion when families isolate their targets. I will provide the funding and the legal network. I need you to lead the operations." Clara read the mission statement printed on the first page of the contract. The strict, clinical demeanor of the veteran private nurse faltered. She reached into her purse, retrieved a tissue, and dabbed at her eyes. She picked up a pen and signed the contract without asking about the salary. My professional life experienced a similar resurrection. The day the federal indictments against Julian made the front page of the local business journals, the narrative shifted overnight. The blind item Nia had published to destroy my reputation became the very evidence used to demonstrate her malice. The director of human resources who had fired me sent a lengthy, carefully worded email. She offered profound apologies for the rush to judgment and formally invited me to return to my previous position in the data department, complete with back pay and a title promotion. I read the email once, archived it, and never replied. Instead, I accepted an offer from their primary market competitor. I walked into a sleek, modern high-rise building to assume my new role as the Director of Data Strategy. My new office featured a heavy glass door that locked from the inside and a team of junior analysts who answered directly to my protocols. I had rebuilt my career on my own terms, leveraging my intellect to secure a position far beyond the cubicle I had been banished from. On a windy afternoon in late October, I drove back to the suburban cemetery. The sky was a pale, clear blue, a stark contrast to the biting rain that had covered the burial service over a year ago. The manicured grass was empty. There were no venture capitalists, no public relations directors, no hired security guards forming blockades. It was just a quiet field of carved stone. I walked up to my mother's grave. The marble headstone bore her name and the dates of her life. I stood at the foot of the plot, the wind catching the edges of my wool coat. I did not feel the crushing weight of rejection that had defined my childhood. I did not feel the bitter sting of the slap that had exiled me. I simply felt the quiet, steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out the thick black leather logbook, Clara's medical ledger, the undeniable record of the truth. I knelt on the damp grass and placed the black book gently against the base of the marble headstone. The truth had washed away the lies. It had stripped the thieves of their freedom and locked them inside concrete cells for the next 8 years. The people who tried to rewrite history were now federal inmates with a designated number, their voices permanently muted by the justice system. I looked at the engraved letters of my mother's name. I realized I no longer needed her to apologize. I did not need her to wake up and recognize that she had chosen the wrong child to trust. I did not need my family to validate my existence or acknowledge my worth. I had survived their betrayal. I had dismantled their criminal enterprise using nothing but my own logic, a clear mind, and the unyielding power of data. I had built a new life, a new career, and a foundation that would protect others from the same darkness. I stood up, turning my back on the grave and the ledger left behind. I walked across the green lawn toward my car, my footsteps steady and unhurried. The wind blew past me, carrying away the last remnants of the past. I stepped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove forward into a life that was finally unequivocally mine. Looking back at the wreckage of the Caldwell Empire, I realized that the most profound transformation did not happen in a federal courtroom or a corner office. It happened the moment I stopped looking at my family through the lens of a discarded daughter and started viewing them as a set of compromised data points. Surviving an orchestrated takedown by the people who share your blood leaves you with a very specific, uncompromising clarity. If there is anything you extract from my survival, let it be this: never fight a manipulator with emotion. When toxic relatives launch a smear campaign, your initial instinct is to scream your innocence, to argue, to beg the world to see the truth. Do not do it. Emotion is their currency. It makes you erratic and predictable. Instead, become a vault. Gather your documentation. Secure your evidence. Let them build their fraudulent narratives as high as they want. The higher they climb on a foundation of lies, the more devastating the gravitational pull will be when you quietly remove the structural supports. The truth delivered with cold precision is the ultimate equalizer. Second, the concept of the golden child is a gilded cage. My brother was handed every financial advantage, every excuse, and every ounce of my mother's devotion. Because he was never allowed to fail on his own, he never built resilience. He learned to construct his life on shortcuts, theft, and deception. The people who are handed everything often collapse the moment the real world demands actual accountability. The rejection that felt like a death sentence when I was 24 was actually a brutal, necessary liberation. It forced me to build an armor they could never afford to buy. Finally, true closure does not require an apology. For years, I carried the quiet, suffocating hope that my mother would wake up one day, see the error of her ways, and acknowledge my worth. She never did. She took her illusions to the grave. I learned that you do not need the people who broke you to put you back together. Your worth is not a metric defined by their approval. You have the absolute right to close the door on toxic bloodlines and walk away without a single ounce of guilt. You rescue yourself. I rebuilt my life from the ashes of theirs, and I did it with a perfectly balanced ledger. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, or if you know the quiet power of outsmarting the people who underestimated you, drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you believe that karma always audits the books, hit the like button and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. We bring you stories of justice, ironclad boundaries, and the ultimate payback every single week. Keep your records clean and never let anyone else write your narrative.